Thank you everybody for joining our call today. We're really hoping to have a productive conversation about the issues affecting our inner city communities. We've got a great panel joining Congressman Brindisi, which is Delvin Moody, the 5th Ward Councilman for the City of Utica, Jackie Nelson, the President of the Rome NAACP, Trinh Truong, I'm gonna just have to say it, former Assembly Office intern, but also representing Occupy Utica, and Patrick Johnson of Save Our Streets and many other hats as well. So without further ado, I want to kick it over to Councilman Moody to get us started.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. And I want to also thank the Congressman for having this virtual town hall with all of us. And I want to thank Patrick Johnson and Jackie Nelson and Trinh Truong for also joining the conversation today. There is so much for us to talk about in terms of inner city. And it was imperative for me to have a conversation to allow people to know and understand that, especially with 2020 and federal elections on the horizon, that these issues are not just limited to a national discussion, but there are issues and concerns that people have and policy solutions that I believe that the Congressman has and those on his team are putting forward to help people on an everyday basis. It's not just local government in terms of city council or Oneida County, but I believe that the Congressman is fighting for solutions that also impact the inner city. And so we are going to talk about that. Most people know him, and if you don't know him, we'll be working very soon to make sure that you do know him. But it's my honor to introduce to all of you listening, and we'll be watching, the Congressman, incumbent, and soon to be reelected, Representative Anthony Brindisi.
Thank you, Delvin, and good evening, everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I wish we could be doing this in person, and we will have more events like this in person, but it's good to be with everyone virtually right now. And thank you, Delvin, for setting up this town hall. And I want to thank our other panelists who are on the call with us tonight. I'll just give a few brief opening remarks, and then I know we have a lot of questions that we want to get to. So let me say that I think we all recognize right now that our country is at a crossroads with a global pandemic, record unemployment, civil unrest, and disparities in healthcare, education, housing, and more for members of our Black and Brown communities. I know that I don't need to tell all of you on the call with me tonight that our elected leaders need to do a better job and do better quickly. So I'm going to say a few words here, but I want to emphasize that I'm here to listen and further the dialogue between all members of our community. My entire public career, ever since I was on the school board, I have served the Utica area. First as a member of the Utica School Board, then in the State Assembly, and now in Congress. And it's my honor to continue to serve, to fight for my hometown and listen to the concerns of everyone across the district. A lot of attention has been brought to this fight lately due to the horrific and heartbreaking murder of George Floyd at the hands of someone that was sworn to protect him. But unfortunately, as we all know on this call, this is not a new fight. The fight for justice, accountability, and equality has been raging for generations, and I would say for centuries. And as your representative, I'm here to tell you that I'll continue that fight with all of you. COVID-19, I think, has laid bare fundamental disparities in our healthcare system, our infrastructure, schooling, and more for our inner city communities. And I'm working in Congress on relief efforts now to take into account those disparities and seek to give additional aid to those communities that have been hit hardest by this pandemic. Just this week, I announced a second round of emergency solutions grants for Utica. These funds will help our most vulnerable, and I know Delvin has been a leader at the city level, making sure that these funds get put to good use. I'm also fighting to make sure that our hospitals that serve our region get the additional aid that they need. Many of our hospitals serve the Utica Rome area and are in need of funding right now to make sure that they can continue to serve the communities that live in our region because of the drop in revenues and the expenses that they've incurred as a result of the pandemic. We want to make sure that our hospitals are still able to serve our communities moving forward. We've also at the federal level made COVID testing and care free, but we need to make sure that we're working together so our communities are better equipped to deal with the health problems that make folks more susceptible to this disease, and the long-term effects from this horrible pandemic are taken care of for everyone. And finally, I want to make sure that you all know that I'm working in Congress to address the systemic racism in our society and trying to enact meaningful reforms to our law enforcement. But as I said in the beginning, I'm here to listen and provide feedback where I can and answer questions that you might have. We all need to be conscious of race and racism and take meaningful steps to end inequality based upon race in our daily lives. I'm committed to doing that. I'm committed to working with all of you, and I want to thank all of you for joining the call tonight. And I'm going to turn it back over to Delvin to dig into some questions.
Thank you, Congressman. As you mentioned, thank you again for securing the ESG grant funding and all of the financial aspects that are coming into the city. And as you know, employment and financial recovery is so important to this community. So Cornhill is actually, it is majority made up of refugee and Asian American populations. Historically, it has often been seen as a minority community, but what that minority means is changing. Trinh, can you speak to what you feel some of the challenges are in terms of COVID-19 and the refugee community, which I think is a portion of our community that sometimes we don't often give major voice to in our city?
Yeah. Hey everyone. My name is Trinh Truong. I was resettled as a refugee when I was 3 years old in Utica and grew up in Cornhill, a product of Utica schools. I graduated last year from Yale with a degree in political science, and currently I am a migration policy and refugee resettlement researcher. So this is kind of like my area of specialty. And I've also been a grassroots organizer for 10 years in Utica, working on education, racial and immigration issues. And so I, even though I'm currently based in Cambodia now and all over the place, I always have my ear to the ground and super connected to local government. So I think that's a super important question that you asked, Delvin. And so to say a little bit about the refugee populations in Utica and in Cornhill, a lot of people are in entry-level, low-wage jobs because of language barriers and also skill gaps that they have from migrating over. So a lot of people in the refugee community are essential workers in working in manufacturing, production, working sometimes menial jobs. And so these are people who, don't have the privilege of being able to work from home or oftentimes getting benefits like paid sick leave. And so that's one vulnerability. And another huge vulnerability is that this population of refugees is overwhelmingly, they're ESL, so English is a second language for them, which means that, when we communicate and health notices, information about testing or hospitals is put out in English, information about social distancing laws and mandates, this isn't something that is relayed super frequently. So I know that our local refugee center has done an amazing job, and the community has supported them in funding billboards across town that, state, like stay at home, stay safe in different languages. But the challenges of that is that the refugee center, under this administration, is increasingly underfunded. At the state level, they've had their additional budget cut by 50%. And so right now they're working with a skeleton crew and not able to get to all the community needs. And so you've got thousands of refugees in Utica that who are struggling to figure out how to navigate getting a stimulus check, are struggling to understand, what does this mean for my child's learning? What does this mean for, what are my rights as a worker? And so language is a huge barrier. And I've been talking to the director of the Refugee Center and other service providers in our community that work directly with refugee populations. And a huge problem is broadband. I think that what can be actionable at a federal level is democratizing broadband. Like, we're talking public broadband, so that everyone has access to the internet. And in addition to that, I also think that, thinking more robustly about language support, the demographics of the US are rapidly changing. And I know that, like, Spanish is understood as, a predominant second language, but as a city, as the town that loves refugees, we kind of need to be thinking more robustly about, how can we quickly get out multilingual content, especially when things are so urgent, like when it comes to a pandemic. Like, usually the translation department at the refugee center can handle these requests, but the translators have been run dry because there are so many different issues. And I think back to the education issue, there just needs to be some more support in terms of home learning for students. And also, I think a question to think about is, how can we make sure that students have the tools that they need at home to learn and to really be getting a 21st century education? So yeah, to sum up, I think, democratizing broadband, language access, and just more communication and, like, uniform messaging, and really doing the extra work to make sure that, like, every community receives any official government message at a really fast rate.
Good.
Yeah, those are all great points, Trin. And I've been very proud to work with our local refugee community ever since my days back on the school board and through the state assembly, and fighting to get more funding here in the state for school districts that have higher percentages of refugee and immigrant students, like we do here in Utica. Also, one of the last things I was able to do on the way out of the assembly was finally get the state to recognize the importance refugee communities have across upstate New York cities, and to get a line item in the state budget to help refugee centers, especially after and in light of the president's travel ban, which affects many of the communities that typically resettle in the Utica area. At the federal level, much more has to be done on all those areas. I've called on the president first and foremost to raise the unacceptably low refugee admission numbers, which hurts communities like ours that have benefited from refugee resettlement. And I'm also a co-sponsor of legislation commemorating March 17th, 2020 as the 40th anniversary of the Refugee Act of 1980. And that's something that we also have to work with as well. On the fundamental issues that you raise, several good points. And I'll say the industries that many of our refugee and immigrant communities work in are the same industries that we called upon during this pandemic to continue to go to work, to keep our economy moving, to keep food on our shelves, and really to make sure that we were all able to get through this pandemic. That's one of the big reasons that I supported the HEROES Act in the House, which is a stimulus bill. A piece of that would include hazard pay for our frontline workers and our essential workers, those folks who have been going and keeping us safe by fighting the public health crisis, but also keeping our economy going during the public health crisis until businesses were able to reopen. That's a big piece of that. Another portion, for the first time ever, we were able to, in the second stimulus package, we were able to get a paid sick leave included in there for workers that had to be out of work because they had contracted COVID-19, or perhaps they were caring for a loved one who may have had the virus, or caring for a child who was out of daycare. I think we really kicked the door open in terms of paid sick leave, and now we need to go further at the federal level for paid sick and family leave, and that's something we're committed to doing in the House, and hopefully we'll have a partner in the Senate that will do the same. On the piece regarding translation, I've heard the same concerns from the Refugee Center. In fact, right before the pandemic, well, before things really started to ramp up, I had a roundtable here in Utica with the county executive, And one of the attendees was the director of the refugee center here, because we wanted to make sure that all the relevant agencies that were going to be on the front line assisting residents through this pandemic were getting the same accurate information in terms of the CDC guidelines and the other federal guidelines that were coming down. So we were able to bring all the stakeholders together in one room to really talk about how we can coordinate services and make sure that everyone gets the care that they need during this time period. Education, I go back to that on so many issues because I really think it's the foundation for our future, and we have to properly fund our schools. Another reason why I supported this HEROES Act, and I hope the Senate sees the light and meets us halfway and we can come to a compromise on this bill, is because of the funding that would go to state and local governments and our school districts. I'm very concerned, given the drop in revenues at the state level, given the expenses that many municipalities and school districts and the state have had to incur because of coronavirus. They're going to start cutting services. One of the biggest that we spend on here in New York is education. And that's going to result in less teachers in the classroom. That's going to result in less programming. It's going to result in fewer support staff. And that's not something we can really afford to compromise here in places like Utica and Rome, which are already struggling to meet budgets. We don't have the same luxuries that some of the wealthier suburban districts have across the country. So when we start cutting, we're going to cut those programs like ESL and other programs that are fundamental for a sound basic education here. And I always say it should not matter what your zip code is to determine what kind of education you're getting. And that's why we need increased funding for places like Rome, places like Utica, other high need school districts, whether they're in the inner city or whether they're in poor rural areas, because the issues of poverty are in many cases the same in those communities. So we have to make sure we're properly funding our schools. And the HEROES Act would provide funding to schools to keep those programs. The state cut back on funding is another element of this. The point you made on broadband is a great point. And I always say that we have to talk about this in terms of underserved communities, because you have gaps in broadband, not only in rural areas, but you have gaps in broadband in the inner cities as well. And there's no way that you can conduct things like distance learning, doing your homework, trying to apply for a job these days without high-speed, reliable internet. So I've been pushing very hard, not only to, number one, to make sure that some of the bigger internet providers are held accountable for not going into these underserved communities because they don't see profit there, but also relooking at how we hand out money at the federal level to make sure that funding does go to the areas that are most in need, and perhaps have plans like municipal broadband coverage, or incentivizing smaller companies who have shown a willingness to go into underserved communities, instead of handing over billions of dollars to the big players who never seem to go into these areas and expand broadband. So that's another piece of it as well, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you, Congressman. So COVID is has so many different facets and dimensions to it, and now that we're going into phase 3, I'm beginning to think about, in terms of social distancing, people are wanting to get back out. Parks are still closed. Youth still have a lot of energy. We see an uptick in, just having a mistrust, real frustration with the state of police in this country. Mrs. Nelson, you run the Rome branch, of the NAACP, which is the largest civil rights and the oldest civil rights organization in the country. In terms of COVID-19 and really the social distancing that we've been seeing, we see a lot of parks closed. We see a lot of young people having that energy, want to get together. I'll ask you first, then I'll go to Patrick Johnson. But what do you feel is missing in the conversation around COVID-19, particularly for the Black and Brown community?
Well, I think what's missing in regards to Rome, Rome is different from Utica. Utica has a larger refugee population. We don't have that. Most of the Black and Brown people in Rome are just franchised. We're not included in the conversation. We're not included in the decision making. and we just kind of go along to get along. And what happened with COVID has woke a lot of people into starting to wonder where they fit into all this stuff. As all the phases start to come, we are trying to make sure that the Black and brown people understand that this is not the time to let your guard down. This is not the time to go back to business as usual. As you know, Black people are 3 times more likely to die from COVID, and most of our folks here in Rome are essential workers. So we kind of try to look out for them and try to educate them. And we're just really, really trying to get a discussion going with our city government, with our city officials. You as a councilman have opened your door and you talk to the people and you hold things like that. We don't have a council person that does that. We don't have anyone that's willing to sit down and talk. So it's up to us, the NAACP, to reach out to people of color in Rome and to make sure that their voices are heard and to make sure that they're getting the things that they need. And at times it can get very frustrating because it's just Rome has gotten real comfortable with not talking to all the people. Patrick and I were talking about this the other night in regards to the difference between Utica and Rome. And Rome has a long way to go and we need help. I am literally calling out for help to get a conversation going with our city government. And that is absolutely crazy to me that we have to do this to get them to have a discussion, let alone get to what the problems are.
Patrick, do you feel some of the same ways that Mrs. Nelson have felt? Do you feel that not only has it impact folks of color, but now that, you know, summer's here, folks want to get out, are you concerned, being with your experience on the street, that there might be an uptick of violence, crimes, youth coming out, older folks wanting to have just be in, which can lead to problems or things of that nature? So how do you feel about the community right now?
Sure. First, Councilman, thank you for the invite, and I want to really thank you for the opportunity to speak to these very glaring issues. And Congressman, thank you for joining us, and thank you all. It's really good to see all of you. Yes, it's what she said. You know, we have some really difficult issues in the Utica-Rome area. I've always noticed that Utica is a slightly different animal than Rome, but we should not get too comfortable in terms of how much better we're doing. I will say that it seems that the elected officials, and before I go into the gun violence, Delvin, I will say that the elected officials locally in this immediate community where I reside here in Utica have been very responsive when the invitation has been sent out to meet with the community, particularly the Black community and other communities that are struggling. There are a few very important things, and I need to say this first before I talk about the gun violence that we're speaking here locally. I've long said that institutional and systemic racism is really America's big problem. And there's no community, and I say this with all due respect, I don't know that there's any community or organization or institution that has not been touched or deeply impacted by systemic racism, and with all due respect, what we call also white racism. And unless we are willing to explore, reflect, and have honest engagement about what that looks like, you know, it was easy, although very problematic, difficult, and traumatizing for many of us to watch that video with the police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes plus. I can't begin to imagine what that felt like. And it was good to see white people and others join Black people in the protests. But there's another knee of racism that is on the neck of Black and brown people. And that's the knee that, it's the racism that people don't talk about often and don't see. Congressman, I salute you. When I first met you and I extended an invitation to you when you had just joined the school board and I asked you to join a community workshop on racism, you didn't let any grass grow under your feet. I've always felt that you have been loyal to every community when it wasn't even popular to do so. And so it seems that unfortunately it takes a crisis and burning buildings. And no, I am not in favor of looting and things that are associated with it. But when I say a crisis and burning building, I'm talking figuratively. It takes something that horrific that has awakened America to see that this issue is, yes, we have an issue with policing, but I'm suggesting that our problem is equally troubling in other institutions, lending institutions, medical facilities, workplaces, schools, so on and so forth. And if we don't explore that, we're only going to get more segregated and the issues are going to be more polarizing. Here in the city of Utica, with the weather getting warmer, unfortunately, we've seen the uptick in violence, in gun violence. Just since the springtime, it seems, and I don't have the raw data in front of me, we have 2 or 3 shootings a week, and unfortunately with somebody getting shot. I just made a house call this morning. So the work that I do, it puts me right at the center with individuals who are charged or who are known shooters and the victims. And Utica has a gang problem. And I know it's going to be a far stretch, maybe for some people to see this, but if we don't look at gun violence connected with systemic racism, if we don't see some connections to that, it's going to make everybody's job harder. Am I justifying gun violence? No. But these are individuals that are marginalized. They've been marginalized since they were kids in school. You know, the Utica City School District, I suspect the same as in Rome, Jackie. You know, we largely have, with all due respect, and this is not to make an indictment, but we often have white women trying to teach Black boys how to navigate and be successful in a community that largely has made Black people invisible. I've lived in Utica all my life. And from the time that I entered kindergarten, from K through 12, I only had 1 Black teacher that I can recall. And she was a female. My point is that we really need to be very intentional about the many ways that systemic racism exists. And so the guys that are out here shooting out on the streets right now, and again, I want to make it clear that I'm not justifying, but these are individuals who have for a long time have just been felt that they are left on the margins. So they create their own market, they create their own lifestyle, whatever that may be. And unfortunately, easy access to guns is the problem. So I'm out in the streets. I have a volunteer group that we call the street team, but they're, you know, and I have a good working relationship with the Utica Police Department. But when we go out into the streets, and again, because of the distrust that largely, well, many people, but especially Black people have with the police, the last people that some people, unfortunately, are going to share information with is our men and women in blue with the badges.
That's right.
So I do believe it would be nice. Hopefully we're in phase 3. With phase 4, the opening of the parks and getting young people engaged in activities. I'm part of a group called Rebuilding the Village that under the leadership of people like Freddie Hamilton and some others, we have planned programs. I think all of you know that I also run a summer league in the summer. Not to say that these programs are going to stop every bullet that's running through the city of Utica, but I'll be darned, I know that they're going to help. So what I'm doing, and I'll close right here for right now, is making house calls with individuals, real dedicated group, but we need funding for these people so that we can all get out there, knock on doors in the community, letting these people know that gun violence and any form of violence is unacceptable. in any community.
Thank you, Patrick. And before you respond, Congressman, I just want to say to all of you who are participating, if you have a question, we'll be going to that very shortly. If you have a question, you can use that feature, I believe the chat feature, to ask a question, and then we will get to those questions from you after this. So Congressman, what can we do, or what's your response in terms of issues of gun violence in the community?
Yeah, good question, Delvin, and thank you both Jackie and Patrick for your comments. You know, I want to go back to Patrick for a second, because you know he brings up the school board days when I had a lot darker hair at that time. But I really do credit Patrick and his workshop, which I remembered taking when I was on the school board, for really helping to open my eyes to these issues across our country. And you know, at that time, I probably felt like a lot of folks and made the statement that I don't see color. And Patrick really opened my eyes to say, well, you should see color. You should be aware of race. You should be conscious of racism. And that's something I really took out of his workshop. And I appreciate, you know, his leadership throughout my time on the school board, in the state assembly, and still listening to him here. I think, Delvin, you called him an old G at the rally. And, you know, he is, but he's very wise, and he's helped open my eyes a lot over the years to issues of systemic racism. And Jackie, you know, I've appreciated working with you so much in the Rome NAACP, and I appreciate how vocal you have been, because that's the key to all of us. You have to be vocal. You know, we all know that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and when elected officials aren't listening, you gotta get vocal, and you gotta exercise your rights at the ballot box if you feel that they're not responding to your concerns, and they should respond to your concerns. You know, we as elected officials, you don't represent just one community or one segment of the population. You don't represent just Democrats and Republicans. You represent everybody, regardless of the color of their skin, and they should all be treated equal. And you should be concerned about what's happening in the whole, not just the areas you're most comfortable talking to. That's why I always I don't mind going into uncomfortable situations, because I always feel that I walk away learning something from that, which can help make me a better person, but also be a better representative of the community that I call home. In terms of gun violence, you know, this is an issue that has plagued our country for far too long, and even since the House passed, which I supported, the universal background checks legislation back in February of 2019, there have been thousands of innocent lives that have been lost to gun violence. And despite 90% of the population supporting something like increased background checks, you have folks like Mitch McConnell in the Senate who won't bring that bill forward for a vote. And that, to me, makes no sense whatsoever. You know, we want to save lives. That's what it's all about. And you know, most of the guns that end up on the streets in Cornhill or the inner cities of upstate New York, they're purchased out of state. They're smuggled into the state, and then they're sold on the street, because you know, we have pretty tough laws here in New York when it comes to gun violence, but in other states you don't have some of those same laws, like universal background checks. So you know, that's something that we need across the country, and I'm going to keep pushing for that because I think it's going to help save lives and keep guns out of the hands of people who want to do harm with them. It's not infringing on anyone's rights. You know, it's just a matter of cracking down on gun violence in our inner cities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So let's talk about, before we get to the questions of others, and certainly this could be a conversation in and of itself about police reform and the state of police in this country, in our state, and in our own cities. We all seen the video with George Floyd. We all carried the signs that says Black Lives Matter. We all believe that criminal justice reform needs to happen, that police reform needs to happen. Congressman, there was a hearing this week about police brutality and the reform that need to happen in our police departments across the country. we've seen the state legislature push for progressive policies that have been widely supported. Some of our own representatives have had differing votes on that, but I know that you have been in support of us all the way. So can you respond to not only 2 weeks ago, you were there, you marched with us, what that moment was like, what that moment was like for you, but also what is the federal government's response to the state of police in this country and the reforms that need to be made?
Well, I would say that in one word, that rally to me was emotional. I think it was emotional for all of us, and I appreciate the invitation to be there. I felt it was important for me to be there because I saw the community that I represent hurting, and I feel that as a representative of this community, any elected leader, you have to be there with the folks that you represent, trying to comfort and heal them and be a part of the solutions to make things better for all of us. And I was so proud walking away with a sense of pride being at that rally, because I saw folks from every different background walking in peace and drawing attention to some of the racial inequities that have persisted across our nation for centuries. And we walked away from a peaceful protest. I saw police officers walking in the march too. And I was just proud to see our community come together like that to hold that rally. You know, we all, many of us have lived in Utica for all our lives, and I can't think of another rally that has generated so many people to attend. I mean, I think there had to be over 1,000 people there, and we just don't see that too often in the city of Utica. And then later on that week, I was actually in the town of Hamilton in Madison County, very white community. 400 people showed up there to march, and I marched with them too. So it's nice to see that it's not just this movement's not just happening in inner cities; it's happening across rural areas as well. And we need everyone to be speaking up as one voice, because that's what's going to get us to change. In terms of police reform, I'll give you just a few updates on what's happening at the federal level. And as I said when I first opened with my comments, I think that the killing of George Floyd was horrific. It was unacceptable, and it's heartbreaking. And unfortunately, this kind of situation and the outrage is all too common for members of the Black and brown communities across our country. There has to be justice for not just George Floyd, but Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and countless others that have come before them. And we all need to join together to call for that change. At the federal level, one of the things that's being discussed right now is a bill called the Justice in Policing Act. I actually, just before this call, I was on a call with Congresswoman Karen Bass. She is the head of the Congressional Black Caucus in the House of Representatives. And Karen has been, I don't know if any of you have seen her on TV or heard her speak, but I told her on the phone, I said, Karen, you're the right person at the right time, at the right place to be leading this legislation. And I appreciate her comments that she has made and her willingness to want to bring people together, Democrats and Republicans together, around some very sensible reforms to help create more trust between police and communities of color. So there was a hearing on the bill yesterday. The bill does a few things, and even the Fraternal Order of Police, which is the largest police union in the country, came out with a statement to say that they were heartened by what they saw in the bill. So I think there's a lot of room for support here, and more importantly, getting something signed into law. That should be all of our goals, getting something signed into law. And the conversations between Democrats and Republicans, I think so far, have been very promising. So hopefully we can produce a product in Congress that can get signed into law. But the areas that the bill addresses really are on accountability, more transparency, more training for police officers. You don't want to have different standards across departments. You have national standards for all different professions, but you have many different standards for police departments. And a chokehold should not be okay in one city and banned in another city. They should be banned across the board, and that's something that's addressed in this legislation. This also creates a national database. So if an officer is fired for disciplinary reasons, they can't go get a job at another police department and do the same thing. So I think there's a lot of good things in here that can be addressed. And the bill right now, I said there was a hearing yesterday. My understanding is it will go for markup next week, which means there'll be opportunities to amend the bill. And then at some point towards the end of the month, there'll be a full vote in the House of Representatives.
Very good. Very good. So if we can have from all of the panel, now listen, I know that it would take hours to talk about all the reforms that need to happen, but I'll start with Trinh, go to Mrs. Nelson, and then with Patrick in 30 seconds or less. What reforms would you like to see amongst our police departments in our cities? And then I'll go to Sarah to give the questions that we have tonight. So Trinh, if you can start, what reforms do you think are necessary in our police department?
So I think that it's really a funding issue, and I think that we need to be thinking about the way that we invest or don't invest in Black and Brown communities. And I feel like there are lots of alternatives to like incarceration, which we know affects Black and Brown people at disproportionately high rates. And a lot of people are locked up for nonviolent offenses and offenses that basically just criminalize poverty. So I would really love to see more funding for programming like those of Mr. Johnson, who I think does really amazing work in the community. I also think something that we need to talk about too in light of all of this is the way that inter-ethnic minority conflict exists in the community. Like anti-Black racism specifically it's real. As an Asian American person, my community is very anti-Black, and we need to figure out how we can have productive and structured dialogue with community members and break down those prejudices. I mean, a lot of these Asian refugees have never seen a Black person before they come to America. They come to America and, they're fed these white supremacist stereotypes and conceptions, and they run with them. And something also that I really want to think about is, to that note related, is the way that underfunding communities plays into this narrative of refugee exceptionalism in Utica. I feel like the Black community is very underserved in Utica, and I feel like it doesn't help when people can, say like, oh, look at the refugees, they're doing so well, why can't Black people do the same? Because that's a function of underfunding, that's a function of systemic anti-Black racism. And that's something that I have noticed in my work over the years. And the last thing that I would also mention too is that, when we're thinking about police reform, I also think that it's very important for the public to be empowered on what their rights are and aren't when they're dealing with police officers. I think, these interactions, aside from getting police to do their jobs and to protect people that they serve in compliance with laws that treat people with humanity and don't leave them dead at, in the middle of very basic interactions, I think that the public needs to be empowered to really know their rights and to be able to use those rights without consequence. So know your rights education is an integral piece to this. That's my spiel.
I agree. Mrs. Nelson?
Yeah, first I want to thank the congressman for his support. He's always been a big supporter of the Rome NAACP, and we certainly appreciate that. I think in regards to accountability and transparency within our police force, we'd like to see body cams. I know a lot of people have different views of that, but I think that will protect not just the citizen, but the police officer as well. So we'd like to see that. And I agree with Trinh in regards to the disparities and the problems between the races, right? Right here in Rome, there seems to be some issues that are starting to reel its ugly head. I think that the police officers should be more engaged positively in the community and not just when things go wrong. So yeah, that's our opinion in regards, and mostly that's what we'd like to see in Rome.
I agree 1000%. Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. Trent, I really loved what you had to say, and I'm prepared to respond. Let's connect and partner and do something to address the inter-ethnic issues and conflict that we and Black and Asians have in other groups. Excellent idea. So along with what the congressman said, one of the things that I believe occurs often and predominantly where the law enforcement is overwhelmingly white, I wonder who's vetting the candidates. And I know that they go through some sort of a psychological test along with everything else. And my point is, I wonder if it would be a really good idea in terms of part of local reform, making sure that really good, conscious, but impartial Black people, maybe some other people of color, are part of the vetting process when police candidates go for the job. My fear is that they're not being asked the right questions. And I'll go back to the police officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck. I remember when I first saw that, I was like, I wonder what he's thinking, and I wonder what his issues were with Black people. It eventually started coming out, and I admit at this point they're just allegations, but allegedly he did have, not only were there issues, I guess, in his history, but I was just watching the news today and they were saying when he was doing some work at a club, it appeared noticeable that he was far more aggressive with Black people. And my point is that very often police officers unconsciously might have biases that are very dangerous to themselves and to other people that are not like them. So in other words, the vetting process, making sure that the right questions are being asked.
I couldn't agree more with all of that. And I think it's that vetting, including people. I know that I've talked to the chief about that, including folks from various communities into the hiring process when they interview these officers.
Yes.
I think that there should be laws and legislation around the fact that police complaints should not be reviewed by the local prosecutor and the DA's office, that they should be done by an independent agent of some sort. I think that we need a civilian review board with subpoena power. I can go on record in saying that I think particularly in Utica that the public safety commissioner should be separate from that of the mayor to make sure that there's greater accountability in our police department. So I think if we start with those things, I think we'll be in the right direction. And I think it's time to really put ego aside, and it's not about political party alone or who's in what office or if you have relationships with that person in the past. We have to do what's right for our people and our constituents. We have to make sure that we have results. So I guess that's my little 2 cents. But I will also now turn this over to Sarah, who I think has a question. I think we only have one question, but has a question, and then we'll go to the congressman for his final remarks.
We do have one question from Larry Tenori, who asks, how do we hold legislators like our Assemblywoman accountable for voting against the repeal of 50A this week? She said she met with law enforcement, but not community leaders or protesters.
Vote them out.
I think it's in the vote. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, look, you got to vote. As a representative, I think there's a lot of power and I know sometimes people feel like, well, if I call, they don't care. If I email, if I write letter, they don't read it. I do, and that's very, very, very impactful to me. The number of statements I get on any particular issue, I think it's very important for us to be able to respond to questions from community leaders. And we got to, it all comes down to voting, as Trinh said. That's the key.
I agree.
Can I say something? I think though too, when you have some politicians and they vote, and a lot of people aren't happy with the way they vote, I think it's their responsibility to explain their vote as well to the people.
I agree.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Can I address a couple things that were raised on the previous question?
Mm-hmm.
I know there was a number of areas that were addressed there, and I do want to mention that part of the legislation at the federal level does include things like independent civilian review boards, independent investigations, body cameras, making available body cameras. See, we're at the federal level, so you can mandate those kinds of things for federal officers. But since Congress also controls the power of the purse, you can incentivize departments to purchase body cameras through grants and things like that. I think those are important aspects of reform as well. Mental health is a big piece of all of this. I really feel, and I've always been a very strong supporter of our law enforcement, and I think that cops don't want to be hated by the communities that they're sworn to protect and serve. And police are being asked to do a lot today that should be handled by other areas. Mental health is a big one. Cops have to deal with mental health issues. They have to be teachers. They have to do all of that because government has not invested properly, in my opinion, in things like mental health care or education or health care or other areas that are important in society. So I think it's, we have to make sure that we're investing in those areas. I think that will make police officers' jobs easier, and then departments can focus on things like community policing and building relationships within those communities instead of having to deal with some of the mental health issues, which should be handled by social workers and other professionals.
I agree. I think that our local police department should, and that's one thing I'm looking into with Councilwoman Friend about how we can increase budgets in a way that we can hire social workers. Sometimes police officers say, well, we're law enforcement, we're not social workers, but I think that mental health component is so important in terms of public safety. I think, Sarah, we have another question.
We do. We have one from Brittany Roundtree. She says, hello, thank you for allowing me to share this space with you all today. My name is Brittany Roundtree, and I'm an educator in the area. My question is directly linked to the changes occurring in the U.S. in the form of systemic injustices and racism being brought forward, and education. In the fall, it's hopeful that we will return to our classrooms and students will begin to ask questions and vent about these issues. There needs to be sensitivity training. I just lost my space. I'm so sorry. For all teachers to address these issues, especially in a district with a large population of Black and Brown students. To the Congressman, what do you propose as a way to ensure that these trainings happen in a way that allows all educators to have meaningful conversation when these questions arise?
Thank you, Brittany. I would say that one of the best things that I can do, in addition to help facilitate those conversations and encourage school districts to provide that kind of training, is to make sure that they have the funding to do that. My big worry, as I mentioned earlier, is that a lot of our school districts are going to start cutting back areas because of the stress that has been put on state budgets and local budgets and all of that. And they're going to cut the things that are not mandated by state or federal government. And that may include some of the types of training that you're talking about. They're going to have a lot of challenges already. School districts are going back in the fall, and especially larger school districts like a Utica or a Rome. If we're still going to have to practice some element of social distancing in the fall, my kids are in Utica schools right now. Sometimes they have classes, and Delvin and Trinh can speak to this firsthand, of 30 or more students. The rooms are already at full capacity without social distancing. Trying to keep students 6 feet apart is going to be near impossible. Trying to bus students is going to be very hard to do in larger school districts. So that's why the funding piece is so important, so they don't start cutting back on those important programs that are necessary for a well-rounded education. You know, one of the things that they've done in the Rome schools, which I've been a big supporter of, are the community school model. And that to me is a really good thing. That should be, every school should be a community school, in my opinion, where students are getting some of the things that they may not be getting at home. They're getting the health care or the dental treatment or the access to mental health care, which they may not be getting outside of the school building. Parents have the opportunity to come in and learn as well. There's after-school programs, there's evening programs, there's before-school programs. These are so necessary in high-needs districts like Utica and Rome to provide for a well-rounded education for students. You know, those are the things that sometimes our funding priorities are out of whack at the federal and the state level, and we're investing in areas that frankly don't need investment, and we're not investing enough in education and mental health care and health and just regular health care to make sure that our most vulnerable communities are getting what they need as well.
I agree.
Sarah, if I could respond to Ms. Roundtree's question extremely quick. I would be remiss if I did not say, just prior to the pandemic, I was doing some training with administrators and teachers in the Utica City School District, about 30 per group. And the one that I did, and I've also done some in the past, and then the pandemic hit. But you make a really, really good point. Once again, a school district, and there are many good teachers, but they're overwhelmingly white, educating and trying to navigate emotions, experiences that are very different from theirs. And it's easy for the biases and the unconscious racism to weave their way into that. So I made a connection with the superintendent. He allowed me to come in and do some work, and then the pandemic hit. But I don't know what's around the corner in terms of how they want to move forward.
Right. So I think we have 2 more questions.
We do. We just got 2 more.
Okay.
This one is from Zeus. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. The question is, do you support defunding the police to pay for those other investments? And should I read the second one or give time for response?
I can respond to the first one. Let me be very clear. I don't support defunding the police. We should be investing in mental health care. We should be investing in education and other areas. You know, we should be prioritizing our funding to do that. And we need to be investing in our police. We need to make sure that our police are receiving the proper training to be able to do the job. It's a very dangerous job, and we want to make sure that they're properly trained to do that. So I don't support defunding the police. And having looked at state budgets and federal budgets, by putting our priorities in the right place, we can take investments and put them in areas that are lacking right now that will help communities of color and communities across the board that are in need of more equitable healthcare and education and things like that.
And on the city side, in terms of defunding the police, what I've come to understand that much of the cry is on par with what Congressman Brindisi is saying. Defunding the police is not necessarily to say abolish the police, and I think some folks have certainly called for that. Some folks have called for a complete abolition of the police, but I think, like the Congressman is saying, that we need to prioritize funding. Right now, if you look at the city budget, the police department is the largest component of the budget, and in most cities across America, the police departments are the largest budget line in the city budget. So we have to look at that, and we have to look at, okay, if we are giving all of these finances and resources to our police department, I'm a person of faith, and the scripture tells me that to whom much is given, much is required. And so I think that is the the core of the message. I know that a few of us who are activists and advocates have been in marketing have been saying maybe we shouldn't have said defund the police, because that sent a misleading message. But I agree with the congressman in the fact that we need to prioritize where we are putting those dollars, looking back at mental health and looking back at those other aspects that will really increase community policing in our cities and cities like Rome and in the Mohawk Valley. Sarah, you have one more question?
There's one more from Kiane, who asked, it seems that body cams are easily turned off by police, and then suggests, shouldn't there be an automatic punishment for serious issues that occur and officers claim their cameras were off? You know, is there, I guess basically, is there any sort of way to force accountability and the cameras to stay on? I guess a way to make sure they can't just turn them off.
So the UPD's existing policy is already that they need to turn their body cams off with every interaction that they have with the public. But the problem is that the officers themselves are required to self-upload all of their video content. So for obvious reasons, like that could be like a conflict of interest there. And there really should be someone who is doing that for them, because it's also very tedious. I personally think that there should be, disciplinary action and like accountability in regards to body cameras. And the good thing is that now that 50A has been repealed and the package of police reforms have been passed in the assembly, that could be like a little bit easier to come by. But other people might disagree or agree.
I could just speak to the Justice and Policing Act. The body cameras portion, the bill would require uniformed federal officers to wear body cameras. Officers would have to activate their cameras whenever they're responding to a service call or initiating a law enforcement or investigative encounter with a member of the public. There would be exceptions if it would endanger confidential or citizen informants or undercover officers or national security, things like that.
Yeah, and in terms of Trin's point, you know, there are a lot of reforms that need to happen that are not necessarily what I call the big ticket items. Like those things about turning police cameras on or off, those are procedures things that we can enact from a city council in conversation with the chief of police. And so, you know, there is so much room, and that's why, you know, while there is such a call to swift action, it's really going to take us putting our minds together to look at every aspect of this. That way there are no loopholes, that the legislation is airtight, that we're really closing up all gaps and making sure that we are holding everyone accountable and putting forth the best legislation. And so to go back to the point about the question that was asked earlier about, you know, assembly members and politicians that have different votes that we would want them to take. This is why local elections are so important. And so I would encourage all of you, I cannot leave this town hall without saying we need you all to sign up to get your absentee ballot. We need you to vote in this election. We need you to keep a member of Congress in office that is fighting for us to help elect other elected officials that are going to be our advocates. This is why local politics matter. I made the point in a speech that I was given, Minneapolis is not a state, it is a city. And that means that it is governed in many ways, most directly by those local officials. And so, you know, your vote matters, and getting involved in local politics is so important. So I want to thank all of you that joined this panel, this town hall. I think it was an exceptional conversation. Certainly not the end, just the beginning, really just a comma in the litany of conversations that need to be had about police reform, gun safety, inner city issues. I know that the congressman is committed to it. I know all of you are committed to it. And I'll turn it over now to Congressman Brindisi if he has any final words before we end this virtual town hall.
I just want to say thank you again, Delvin, Patrick, Jackie, Trin, for being on the panel tonight. Look forward to doing more of these, especially in person when we can do that again. I just appreciate all of your leadership addressing these issues. And as I said, I'm here and want to be a partner.
Thank you. Thank you. You all have a good night.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you,
Good night.
everybody.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yep.